Buonasera. Grazie. Okay. I'm here tonight to talk about slavery and liberation. And I'm going to briefly cover the 19th century slavery issue in the United States, the abolitionist movement against that, compare that to animal slavery and the current abolitionist movement. In the U.S., the movement in the U.S. I will talk about is important because it was much more dynamic from the underground, from slave revolts, and much more violent than what happened in England. Their abolitionist movement was legal and led by white elites mostly. And when I talk about the new abolitionist movement for animal liberation, I will explain one of the dominant models prevailing today and why this model is absolutely flawed and a total dead end. And I'll briefly sketch a different kind of abolitionism that is much richer and much more radical and gives us much greater hope for the times that we live in, which are defined by social and ecological crisis. Now, slavery, like patriarchy or like hierarchy, is actually a very recent phenomenon. Slavery, patriarchy, other forms of hierarchical domination in society are not that old. The first forms of human slavery go back to ancient Sumer toward the very beginnings of civilization. Now, when I say civilization, I mean something very specific. I mean agricultural society, which began 10,000 years ago. And for millions of years before that period, all of our history as humans and all of our human ancestors lived in small hunting-gathering bands. But one of the most radical changes to ever happen in human history happened just 10,000 years ago when we began to settle in one location and began to farm and to domesticate the wild plants and animals. 10,000 years ago, that's all. Before then, no patriarchy. Before then, no hierarchical domination. Before then, equality within society, basic harmony with nature. So, actually, the first form of slavery was the enslavement of animals. That began with agricultural society. Because again, agricultural society means the domestication of the wild, the domestication of plants. We cultivate plants. The domestication of animals, we start to breed animals. We start to keep animals and to exploit them for our use. It's the beginning of a process that culminates today with genetic engineering, whereby we take the wild and we colonize it and we change it technologically and exploit it for our purposes. So, for instance, we began to use animals for food, for transportation, and for labor. We brought them into our societies. They no longer ran free or wild. We confined them. We branded them. We castrated them. We controlled these animals and exploited them in any number of ways. And now this is a very important point that very few people understand. Racism, sexism, ableism, and many forms of human hierarchy have their origins in speciesism. And of course, by speciesism, I mean the philosophy that we are radically unique from all other animals, that in fact we are not even an animal, we are superior to them, and they exist for our purposes, and we can do what we wish with them. When you ask the question, who is the human being? Who is Homo sapiens? What's the answer? Rational man. Rational man. In other words, we deny rationality to animals, we deny our own animality, and we establish ourselves as a pure rational essence, a mind without a body almost, as Descartes later said. Now, that means that if the human is the rational, any form of human, any type of human group, women, people of color, islanders, the disabled, etc., if they are thought to be less than rational, they are said to be less than human. They are closer to animals than to humans. So we call them subhumans. And every time we go to war with another nation, we always reduce people to animals. They are rats, they are dogs, they are monkeys, they are vermin. Always they have to be dehumanized, and then they are easy to kill. Because we already have speciesism as the foundation of our conceptual thought thinking and of our society, of our civilization. So we've created this box, animals, no reason, no moral status, and we can take any people, drag them into that box by saying they have no rationality, therefore they have no rights. So I'm saying that if you believe in human rights, you better believe in animal rights, because you will never get human rights without animal rights, and vice versa. If you want to abolish sexism, if you want to abolish racism, you must understand these philosophies came from speciesism. So when civilization came about and we domesticated animals and we defined ourselves in sharp opposition to them as rational beings, we treated women like animals. We treated slaves who were captured from warfare like animals. They were not full members of society. We bred them like animals. They were considered to be resources for breeding, for exploitation, just like animals. Now, all the technologies that were used to enslave human beings in the modern international slave trade, chains, whips, cages, auctions, branding, all of these things were first done to animals. And the first philosopher of slavery was Aristotle. Aristotle created a hierarchy of value in the universe. It was a scale of perfection, and the more rationality a being had, the more perfect that being was. So God was at the top of the hierarchy, humans were not far below, and women and slaves were toward the bottom, and animals were at the very bottom. And to quote Aristotle, just as plants exist for animals, so animals exist for humans. So lower forms of life serve the purpose for higher forms of life. Slavery was a natural and just fact of the universe. There was nothing wrong about it. It was natural. And thus you have the beginnings of Western thought. Western thought is grounded not 2,500 years ago, but in the beginnings of agricultural society, and that's rooted in speciesism and the domestication of animals. So now, jump ahead to the 15th century when the international slave trade begins with Henry the Navigator in the early 15th century taking slaves from Africa to Portugal, and then of course Columbus, 1492, taking slaves from Africa and various islands to Spain and other European nations. In the United States, slavery had reached its height. Millions of slaves taken from Africa across the dreaded Middle Passage, and they went to the absolute worst country you could go to be a slave. And just like we did with animals, we shipped them, we chained them, we beat them, we auctioned them, we branded them, we broke up families, and we sent them off for slave labor for their owners. Now, actually, what I'm saying so far is very controversial. And what I want to do is define what a slave is and respond to two objections to using the word slavery to apply to animals. So I'm saying animals are slaves, they can be slaves, they are the oldest, it is the oldest form of slavery, and it is the most prevalent, dominant, bloodiest, barbaric form of slavery ever invented, and it continues and it is escalating. So what, you have to have two legs to be a slave? No. A slave is any being, any sentient being who knows the difference between pleasure and pain and between freedom and domination. A slave is any being held captive against its will. A slave is forced to labor for another. This slave is the property of this other, and this other is the owner of the slave. The owner has legal rights, including the right of life and death over the slave. So a slave is any sentient being, human or non-being, with its will denied, its freedom denied, its basic instinct to be free denied to it. Its natural life instincts are thwarted, controlled, and blocked. It is a subject, the subject of a life reduced to an object, to a mere resource, thing, and commodity. And it is violated and perverted in every facet of its life. Now let me give you some examples of how animals are slaves, and I think you'll start to get a clear idea of what I mean by animal slavery. Consider a few different cases. 1. Circuses, zoos, rodeos, and aquariums. In every case, they're held captive against their will. They're taken from the wild. They're taken from their families. They are forced to labor, which we call performance. In a zoo, your performance is just to be there, but you're performing for an audience. For instance, in an aquarium, why do you think orca whales kill their trainers? They're confined in a small artificial tank. They are compelled to perform labor up to 6 or 8 shows a day before a bunch of screaming idiots. Thank you. Thank you. Let's hear it. Thank you. I appreciate it. Molto grazie. Consider another case. Oxes, horses, and mules, or horse carriages, an issue here recently in Italy. They're held captive, they're owned, they're forced to do labor. They're enslaved in every sense of the word. 2 more examples, slightly more subtle or complex. Farmed animals. Think of a chicken in a cage, in a battery cage. Think of a dairy cow tied to a machine, a milk machine. They're held captive, they're owned, their property. What is their labor? They're forced to produce what? Forced to produce eggs, forced to produce milk. Eggs, will they do forced molting to make them produce more eggs than naturally they will? Cows are pumped full of genetically modified growth steroid hormones to produce far more milk than they normally would. That is their labor. Okay? They are slaves. One more example. Think of laboratory animals, rats, mice, rabbits, etc. Cats, dogs. You would think, what do they perform to do? They don't make entertainment. They don't do shows. They don't make products. What is their labor? What is their labor? Their bodies are violated to produce data. The data is used to produce drugs that kill humans. I hope I've made a case that it makes sense to use the term animal slavery. The animals are slaves in a very literal sense. Now, there are 2 controversial responses to this. Especially in the United States, this is a very sensitive issue. You might know the PETA campaign, where they say that animals are slaves, and they juxtapose a picture of animals in cages with chains, say an elephant, with African Americans in chains. They did not score any points with that campaign. The African Americans, almost without exception, denounced that campaign as racist. And do you know what the problem with that campaign was? Do you know why they objected to it? They have been likened to animals their entire history. Now, of course, they are animals, we are animals, and there should be no objection to that, but given the context of slavery, one can understand this is a natural reaction. And one should be very sensitive about such analogies and comparisons. And so one has to wonder, if there was speciesism, could there have been racism? If we never had speciesism, could we have had racism? But despite the just objections to the PETA campaign, I have to insist that animals are slaves just like humans are slaves. And in fact, that African Americans could not have been enslaved without the conceptual paradigms and the technologies already used on animals. And I don't want to get into this, but there are similar problems with the analogy of Holocaust. I say this word all the time. I can't say it in Germany. They don't like that. The animal Holocaust. Jewish people object to that because they feel it detracts from their unique historical experience. But if you read Charles Patterson's book, The Eternal Treblinka, you can see the Jewish community is divided over this. Some people say it is only by being a victim of the Nazi Holocaust I can understand the animal Holocaust and condemn this. I have experienced what it's like to be treated that way. Okay, now the second objection, and then we go into abolitionism. The second objection comes not from African Americans, particularly the United States, but from Marxists, from the leftist community. Being a Marxist, being a leftist, being an anarchist almost my entire life, I feel safe in saying that Marxists, anarchists, and leftists are idiots. In the 19th century, they could believably, thank you. In the I am not a conservative. You got that point, huh? In the 19th century, the Marxists could say, we hold the mantle of progress. We champion the most advanced moral values and scientific values. And the left in general was indeed on the progressive cutting edge of change in society. What happened to send them back to the Paleolithic era when it comes to understanding animal rights? They make the weakest objections to animal rights. They are the most difficult speciesists to have a rational conversation with. They believe they, of course, are all carnivores, and they have internalized the worst aspects of Western culture in terms of anthropocentrism and speciesism. They've internalized it more than anyone. Now the left says this. The left says that it's the Cartesian worldview. Animals are machines. They are governed by instincts. They have no complex subjectivity. They don't have free will. So how can you be a slave if you don't have free will? The anarchist, Mikhail Kropotkin, said, define humans as the animal that rebels. The only animal that rebels. That was his definition of the human. Are you kidding me? How many thousands of examples could I give to you about animal rebellion, animal revolt, animal revenge? How many circus tigers wait for that right moment to rip apart their trainer? How many orca whales just one day lose it and drown their trainer, kill their trainer intentionally without mercy? There are so many examples. I refer you to a book you must read. It's in English, I'm sorry. It's by an author named Jason Reibel, R-H-I-B-A-L, Jason Reibel. And it's called I'm forgetting the title, but something like the Revenge of the Animals, Fear of an Animal Planet, The Fear of an Animal Planet. And as you have all read, you've seen one time or another, there are thousands of examples of animals resisting. Why? Because they want freedom. They refuse to be slaves, and they will wait for the right moment to rebel. They will patiently wait, and they know they might receive punishment, but they will rebel. Now, let me talk about the abolitionist movement against human slavery in the United States. This movement began in 1832 and ended in 1865 with the formal end of slavery. Of course, there are all kinds of positions about slavery in the United States. Some people said that blacks should stay slaves. That was the position of the slave owners, and indeed the U.S. political elite and the U.S. Constitution said that blacks are property who should be slaves. There were people who said just get rid of this problem, repatriate African Americans back to Africa. Just get rid of them. There were people who said this is an awful system, we must reform it. We must treat the slaves more kindly. And then there were the abolitionists. And the abolitionist position was, you do not regulate slavery, you can only abolish it, and abolish it immediately, totally, completely, no compromise, right now. The only humane way to treat a slave is to free it. Now, I want to emphasize just a few things about this movement because it's important for the so-called new abolitionist movement today. Namely this movement was very diverse and plural in its composition and in its tactics. This movement included men and women. Feminists in the United States, the suffragettes, started off their political careers in the abolitionist movement. This movement included rich people and poor people. It cut across class lines. It had sympathizers far and wide. This movement included whites and blacks. And amongst the blacks, it included free blacks and blacks who were still enslaved. Lots of different people claimed affiliation to and supported the abolitionist movement in the United States. Now, their tactics were also very diverse, and this is important. They struggled through legal means. They tried to educate the masses. The abolitionists were agitators. A lot of them were white agitators like William Lloyd Garrison. They ran newspapers. They tried to educate people to realizing that blacks and whites were equal, that this was against the Bible, it was against the Constitution. And then there was the violent edge, okay? There was John Brown. John Brown was a tall man who looked like God with a white beard. He was a fervent Christian. And he led a small band of men, including his own sons, in an armed uprising against the army. They were captured, they were killed, John Brown was hung, and forever today he remains a hero and an inspiration to all liberators. Nat Turner was a black slave. One night he gathered together a group of men with guns and swords, and he killed 55 white slave owners in one night. Needless to say, he was executed, but his act of defiance inspired more defiance everywhere. And then there was an amazing woman, a short, black, older woman named Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was the engineer of the Underground Railroad. Now, I don't mean that literally. There wasn't a railroad where slaves, were shipped all the way to Canada and to the free North. But it was a series of homes and safe stations, all one after the other, people who would take in slaves, feed them, care for them, get them to the next place, all the way to the free North or all the way to Canada. Appreciate what this woman did. She freed herself as a slave. She came back and freed her family. She came back and freed friends and anyone who had the courage to come with her. The miles were uncountable. The weather could have been brutal. The conditions were dangerous. She did this at least a dozen times, always successfully, and in fact, toward the end of the Civil War, she knew the territory so well that the North hired her as a scout into the South to fight the Southern Confederate Army. Obviously, she broke the law. She didn't give a damn about the law. As I say, when the law is wrong, the right thing to do is break it. She broke it every chance she could. Now, does the Harriet Tubman or the Underground Railroad remind you of anything happening in the contemporary animal liberation movement? Oh, say something that emerged in England in the 1970s, the mid-1970s? Does it remind you of the Animal Liberation Front? They, too, had a series of veterinarians who would help, people who would rehome cats and dogs with tattoos on their ears. They had a series of places to take animals to freedom when they took them out of laboratories. And they called that the Underground Railroad. This movement, again, was highly diverse. It had some extremely radical tactics. It used anything and everything that worked, and it continues today to inspire the animal liberation movement. So let us now turn to the contemporary animal liberation movement, or what is sometimes called the new abolitionism. Now, of course, there are many diverse tendencies in the animal advocacy movement, most generally, welfarism, rights, and liberation. Let's start quickly in 1975, when Peter Singer wrote a book called Animal Liberation, the so-called Bible of the animal liberation movement. That's not even funny, because that book was a marketing ploy that had nothing to do with animal liberation. I give credit to Peter Singer as a philosopher who wrote something meaningful instead of abstract, meaningless shit. That was the book that changed my life. I was a dietary vegan, and I became an ethical vegan and an animal rights activist instead of a human rights activist because of that book. But it had nothing to do with liberation. It was utilitarian, it was welfare. That means anytime we can trade the interests of an animal for a human, and there's more satisfaction on the human side instead of the animal side, then we will favor humans over animals. So, of course, the stronger position that we want is rights, not welfare, but rights, because a right says that it's like a no trespassing sign. No one can ever violate your basic right, such as bodily integrity, no matter what good it brings someone else. Never can you be violated for any higher purpose. So in 1983, not 1975, now 1983, Tom Reagan wrote a book called The Case for Animal Rights, and now we had the philosophical foundations for a true rights movement, which again is much stronger. Now we don't trade animal interests against human interests. They have absolute protection. No, however it benefits humans, for instance, no vivisection, even if it was scientifically valid, and of course it's not. But what happened in the United States and elsewhere, certainly in the United States in the 1980s, the animal rights movement lost its way and it became a self-parody. It spoke in the language of rights, but it was using welfare policies. Worse than that, the largest two groups in the world, the Humane Society of the United States, HSUS, and PETA, became active collaborationists with animal exploitation industries. They promoted the idea of humane meat and humane slaughter. They gave good advertising press to these industries. They duped consumers, some of them vegetarians or vegans who went back to the carnivorous lifestyle because they never were there for the right purposes anyway, but they promoted the myth that we can eat meat. Again, it's ethical because it's humane meat or it's humane slaughter. They didn't serve the interests of the animals, they served the interests of corporations, and they served their own interests. Not exactly abolitionism, is it? Remember, the abolitionists did not ask, beat the slaves 3 times a week instead of 5. They did not ask, give them better bedding and more food. They said, end the slavery altogether. So this movement, and I mean worldwide, has lost its way. We have become fearful. We have compromised everything. We are winning tiny little battles that are meaningless as we're losing the vast, huge war because we lost the political nerve that the abolitionist movement, for instance, never lost. Now, in the 1990s, a certain man tried to set this movement back on track. You may have heard his name. He is a professor, a lawyer, and an author of many books. His name is Fran Sione. Now, let me be as kind as I can. Fran Sione made a very effective critique of welfarism and the collaborationism and co-optation of the mainstream animal movements. There's no question that that was a service. But he had no idea how to implement his abolitionist ideas into practice. He had terrible politics, and he ultimately had no vision whatsoever for leading this movement that he had established himself as the sole authority and leader of. Let me give you some examples of the problems with Fran Sione's abolitionism. Again, he had it right. Our job is not to reform the institutions, not to regulate the killing, but to stop it altogether. That's the right emphasis. But he had no idea what to do with this emphasis, and he had some really atrocious politics that were very conservative, as I'll now describe. First of all, he's a self-professed Jain, a Jainist, and so he's an extreme pacifist. So extreme that he says, I'm violently opposed to violence, and he will not accept anything that is any kind of threat or threatening language, or certainly any kind of sabotage. Nothing. He is an absolute pacifist. He makes Gandhi look like a maniacal killer or something. So for Fran Sione, the Animal Liberation Front is out of the question. He condemns it in as strong as terms as the FBI or the police. In fact, he uses the same language. It's violent, and it's terrorist, and it's counterproductive. It gives the movement a bad name. Excuse me, but the Animal Liberation Front has been the most effective weapon this movement has had in 4 decades. Excuse me, but they have liberated over 100,000 animals that no one even knew were imprisoned. Excuse me, but I draw a distinction between breaking a window or breaking down a door and slicing a pig's throat and hanging it up on a hook. Those are not equal forms of violence. Property destruction is not violence. The Animal Liberation Front declares itself to be a non-violent group, and indeed it is. So Fran Sione is a traitor who condemns the Animal Liberation Front in stronger terms than the FBI will. What will he allow? Do you know about the Spanish group that does open rescues? You know the term open rescues. This is meant to be a very different tactic from the ALF. It's meant to minimize or to avoid any property damage, to go in non-violently, take animals, and never wear a mask. Because for Gandhi, you should always take accountability for your actions. Fran Sione condemns open rescues. The Spanish group, Animali, help me out, he had a very bitter and nasty debate on his side with that group in rejection of their tactics. That they're violent and you're breaking the law. He allows no demonstrations, he allows no protests, no legislative work. Now, most legislative work is welfare work. They create laws that mean nothing. But at a local level, you can abolish circuses with legislation. So what do we have left for Mr. Fran Sione, the new abolitionist, for us to do to liberate animals? And here is the mind-blowing answer for all of us to follow every day in our lives. Vegan education, and nothing but. Now, to show you just how apolitical this approach is, they never leave Facebook, they never leave their homes, they never go out in the streets. It's all done on the computer. This I find very interesting. They make vegan outreach pamphlets, but they give them to other groups to hand out. In short, I'm not exaggerating, this is true. To be an abolitionist means to do absolutely nothing. Wait, I must qualify that. I must qualify that. Qualify that. It means to attack everyone that doesn't agree with you, to denounce everyone not a part of your cult, and to sabotage anyone who tries to do it any other way through any dirty trick or tactic necessary. To be an abolitionist in the Fran Sione camp means to blog to the converted. and attack everyone else. Now, do you understand what a decline this represents in social movements in general? It's a symptom of the post 9/11 era when everyone is so terrified of doing any action that they will be arrested or denounced as a terrorist that all they feel comfortable or safe in doing is handing out vegan pamphlets. It is a symptom of a consumerist capitalist culture that is fragmented, that has no community, that allows people to do their own blogging in their own way so long as they bow to the king. Understand this. These are people who follow the words of Gandhi and King. They quote them better than anyone, but they never follow their actions. Did we forget that Gandhi and King were about action? Did we forget they said take it to the streets? Did we forget they said our objective is to provoke confrontation with society, not wait for it to come to us, bring it to them. Non-violently, to be sure, with respect and dignity, to be sure, but bring on a confrontation with society, break the law, sit down, march, take salt from the sea, sit at the lunch counter, stop the machine from running by putting your bodies in the way. Let us fill the jails, King said, with singing children. Now, I got to tell you something. I used that phrase in the speech I gave in Germany recently. I said, we will fill the jails with singing children. A direct quote from Martin Luther King. And I'm reading these mindless pacifists on a forum, taking my speech apart. And they didn't even know it was a quote from King, first of all. And one guy said, my God, Dr. Best is anti-family. He wants our children in jail. Quoting Dr. King that they didn't even recognize. Now, King and Gandhi, okay, forget about if you support ALF or violence, whatever. Forget that for now. King and Gandhi we can respect because they were men of action. They were brave, they were courageous, they always went in the face of danger. Yeah, danger for the Fran Sione abolitionist pacifist is plugging your computer into the same socket as your electric popcorn maker. You might blow a fuse. So pacifism was never a good word. And that's because it suggests being passive. That's why Gandhi called his philosophy satyagraha, soul force, soul power. But understand the political decline globally, really globally, in social movements and certainly in our movement. In the 1950s and 60s, or 40s, back to Gandhi, we had pacifism. Now this is a pun in English, try to get this. P-A-C-I-F-I-S-M, pacifism. And what we have now literally is passivism. There is no action. There is something called vegan outreach, which is a white elite giving a pamphlet to another white elite. And that is not outreach, my friends. That doesn't get to the poor, to the people of color, to the people in communities, to the families in need. That doesn't get to anybody but fellow elites. So let me tell you something about education and veganism, okay? We got a problem here. This movement is operating with an infinite model of time. Educate people, be patient, and we have a finite model of time in the world. We have very little time to stop the ecological crisis and runaway climate change. I believe in education. I'm an educator. I'm a professor, obviously. I'm not a saboteur. I wish. I believe in education, but I know the limits of education. Paulo Freire, the famous critical pedagogue or educator, said, education is the key, but it is not the only answer. Number one, not everybody can be educated. Don't we know that? You can talk to some people all day about veganism, racism, capitalism. They will never understand. We have to understand human psychology. This movement is very naive and primitive about this. There are so many ways that people can block messages, block truth, and shut you out, that education is a highly problematic strategy, and we don't even understand yet. We're not sophisticated enough to practice education effectively. And number two, if you're an exploiter with a vested material interest, forget education. There's only one option. That's force. Number three, education's too slow. It's too slow. It's too slow. We don't have the time, and this is what the scientists are telling us. They're all saying climate change is happening much more rapidly than we could possibly imagine. James Hansen, the famous NASA scientist, one of the first people, I think in the 1970s, began talking about climate change is a real problem we have to face in this society, and it is going to happen. It's going to happen quickly and overtake us, and it will be runaway climate change unless we stop it. And he recently went before a Senate hearing and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to confess, I was wrong. I underestimated how serious this problem is." So let me just suggest, education is not going to work. It's too slow. Veganism is not going to work. It's too slow. In the United States, less than 1% of people are vegan. Well, when are we going to get that critical mass? In the year 55-25? When there's no planet left, there's no life left? One more example from Fran Sione, and then I'll try to make some suggestions and we can talk about this. This is an exact quote. Fran Sione said, "If you do nothing else today, tell one person at the grocery store to go vegan." Gandhi and King led massive, gigantic social movements. Can you imagine if Gandhi or King said, "If you do one thing today, friends, tell one person that the British government is a bad system or that you should not be a racist." And that is the leading authority of the new abolitionism, and this is pathetic. Fran Sione wants to equate his abolitionism with the only possible version of abolitionism. But there are many forms of abolitionism that we can each invent in our own ways. I will end now by just trying to suggest 2 or 3 general ideas of what we should be doing. I want a radical abolitionism. I am tired of this apolitical, lifestyle vegan, Facebook bullshit. We have got to get out of our homes and into the streets. We have to learn how to form collectivities once again. We have to become part of a resistance movement. We have to abolish speciesism. We have to abolish racism. We have to abolish sexism, homophobia, ableism, and capitalism. Cannot abolish speciesism without abolishing capitalism. This system is unsustainable. This system is taking the planet down, and it will not stop until every riverbed is polluted or dried, until every last tree is chopped down, until every person is in chains and every animal is cut into pieces. Of course, we should be vegans, but we cannot solve this problem with veganism. So what we need is to go back maybe and look at the original abolitionist movement in the United States or other such movements. Go back and look at the spirit of militant action in history. The abolitionists, the labor movement, the suffragettes, the civil rights movement, the anti-nuclear movement, the anti-war movement, they all used radical, direct action tactics. They often used sabotage. The pacifists want to take everything off the table but one thing: education. I want to put every damn thing on this table. Nothing comes off if it works. Because this global system has advanced too far, it's too violent, it's too predatory, it is clearly at war with all of us and with everything, and we have to stop it, as Malcolm X said, by any means necessary. And we are so small a movement, the only chance we have is to unite with other movements. We build bridges with the civil rights movements, with the feminist movements, with the gay lesbian movements, with the anti-privatization movements, with every progressive movement we can, the environmental movements. You remember what happened in New York City last year? Well, didn't that catch us all by surprise? Wasn't that amazing? And the United States, the land of TV? Who were those people? Who were those people? Guess who they were not? They were not vegans, and they were not animal rights people. The critical numbers, the critical mass, the critical resistance we need is in the other movements. I'm going to end with the problem and not an answer. I don't know how we do this, because the social movements are speciesist, anti-vegan, anti-animal rights. The vegan movements and the animal rights movements are anti-speciesist and disdain the social justice movements, have no connection with them whatsoever, no dialogue, no communication, no understanding. And we have so much to teach each other. We have so much to offer one another. We can never do this without all of us together in the politics of total liberation. Animal, earth, human liberation are one project that if we cannot get this together as one mass resistance movement, as strong as the system of power itself, we have no chance. But so far, I don't see any signs that there is communication amongst these movements, that there is any significant bridge building. And so, as they say, we will stand together or we're all going to fall as one. So I just want to say that the challenge before us is incredible. Do not underestimate it. If you're going into a cage fight or a Roman gladiator game, never underestimate your opponent. We have the toughest opponent. We have the biggest challenge. We're at the most unique and important moment in history right now. We cannot be underestimated. We cannot blow this. We have got to step up the game, rethink everything, and we have got to make connections, or planetary war is on, and it will end an apocalypse. So this isn't a message of defeatism, okay? When you're down, and we're down, we're weak, we're down, we're losing ground, we're losing ground. When you're down, you fight harder. You don't fight less, you fight harder. So let's fight harder. Let's first get a grip on what the problem is, how serious it is, how much we need to do, how much we need to come together, and let's try to get it done with all that we got. That's the message of hope. That's what we need to take away tonight. Grazie. Yeah, yeah. Okay, all right.